Can't get enough BYU football? Listen to Cougar Nation. Mitch Harper takes your calls Monday nights from 6 to 7 on KSL News Radio. Podcast at kslnewsradio.com.
That's right. Cougar Nation tomorrow night. It makes it sound like that you're just going to take calls, Mitch, like at your house. Just your cell phone number. Should we give that out too? Let's say, hey, call Mitch Harper if you have any issues. Like he'll be the shoulder to cry on. He'll give you some stats. You know, speaking of stats, by the way, we've talked a lot on 1st and 12 this year. Some of the bad stats that BYU's kind of had to kind of, you know, how historically bad the offense has been. I did notice today that they did not get to 400 yards in a game in the entire season for the first time since the late 1930s. And I throw out that 1945 year just because they only had 7 games and our nation's at war. I mean, that's how bad of I mean really we've had to dig so far back in the decades to be able to figure out how historically bad this team was on offense. I mean, it just is crazy too. It's crazy, Mitch, because it was such a bad game from a perspective of they're scoring, they're moving the ball, except for in the second half. I don't think that they eclipsed even the 60-yard mark in the second half, 70-yard mark. I don't know what it was. They got to overtime, and they had more yards, but it was all the things that came back and haunted them all year long. Time of possession, they lost that one. They had 20-something fewer plays than Oklahoma State did on the game. Everything, the third down conversion was abysmal. But, I mean, to be 47% completion rating completion percentage for Jake Retzlaff, I just can't imagine that BYU feels comfortable. And Kalani Sitake obviously mentioned it this last segment where you start talking about all these young quarterbacks. It's like, dude, I don't want to hear about all the young quarterbacks. Like, none of those guys are ready. You know what I mean? Like, none of those guys are ready for BYU. And Jake Retzlaff is not the guy either. And so I don't know what the transfer portal is going to bring. And you hate the idea of having to go out and try to find a Keaton Slovis type guy like they did last year where they thought they had kind of hit a home run in the transfer portal. But at the very least, they have to go find somebody at quarterback in the transfer portal.
You need to go get an underclassman. You know, and I say this name because he's got local ties. But, you know, Devin Brown at Ohio State, you know, what's his thought process? Because he's, you know, sitting behind McCord at Ohio State and, you know, they lost. Maybe there's going to be a battle again. But if he goes into the portal, you know, that's the type of prospect you want. A guy that maybe doesn't have a massive, you know, sheet of games. You know, I think everyone thought, Slovis has played 30 starts in his career. But really, it ended up being he was who we thought he was in January.
Right. Yep.
And I think everyone kind of bought into he's a perfect fit off the field. He's the leader. And he really
100%.
embraced and leaned into BYU way. Like, Keaton Slovis, I look as a BYU man through and through now. But on the field, he was who we thought he was. And Jake Retzlaff, because of how poor BYU's offense was heading into West Virginia, his little bit of success with 42 pass attempts felt like there was a glimmer of hope. But then it just got yanked out against Iowa State, and then the 100-yard pick six against Oklahoma, and the inaccuracy was just horrendous against Oklahoma State. To where the thing is, it's nice about coming out of this game, Alex, that you really have now a good sense of who Jake Retzlaff is. Because if it was just Retzlaff against West Virginia and then 3 more starts of Slovis, you might be saying Retzlaff's the guy. But now you kind of know. And he's probably, at best, a career backup in D1 college football unless something drastically changes for his development in the way he passes the football. So BYU's got to be in that portal unless they get some immense, potential from or improvement from some of these young guys. And, Ryder Burr and Kalani mentioned, if you want to talk about like long-term, like who could be the next big thing, it probably is him. But you're right, though. If he was that good already, he'd be playing, and they wouldn't be trotting out what they did on Saturday, and there was a lot of issues.
Yeah, think about what he said, too, where he's like, look, Zach had a lot of time in the system. Jaron had a lot of time in the system, right? And these other guys do not. These other guys that we threw in there did not. And you're exactly right. We were so head over heels about how Keaton Slovis was going to mission farewells with his teammates. He's hanging out. He's right. We got totally sold on him being a chemistry fit because we wanted it. Like, hey, it's hard to get that culture fit, right there at the beginning with a guy who's not an LDS kid, but he comes in. It seems like he's totally buying in to everything that BYU stands for, except for the part where if you're going to be a BYU quarterback, you better freaking sling it, man. And that's the real tradition. No one cares if you can get along with your buddies and hang out and have a good time with them if you can't win football games or if you can't score points. It just is. It doesn't. That's the part where you're like, this is the most out of character BYU team I've seen since the Gary Croton years. I mean, even when BYU was bad in 2017, you're like, yeah, but they still have some talent. They still have some things going on here, and they were still having these 500-600 yards or 400-500-yard games, even against bad teams. But to be totally out of
that was a brutal team. 17 was
they were awful.
Was that the
worst? They were awful.
They were the worst.
You know what?
The worst.
No, they were bad. They were bad. But this one seems so out of character. Right? It seems so – because that one was like, oh, man, you're missing Taysom Hill now and you're missing Jamal Williams. Like those guys, were NFL dudes, and you didn't know how good of NFL guys they were when they were there. But this one was so out of like you didn't recognize anything what this team was doing this year. Nothing.
And I think that's a great point. And it's a great point, Alex. And I think what is compounded by that, think back to fall camp. Aaron Roderick said they upgraded at every position on offense, and the only spot that you maybe say they didn't is at quarterback because it was a wash. And then, he was saying the offensive line last year was Big 12 ready. They were not. And It was just a total step back. And Kalani Sitake told me at Big 12 Media Day, deepest team he's had since he was at BYU. And I think that, to his credit, I do believe that there was some talent there, but I think it was measured by BYU standards. I think BYU got a harsh reality that you do not judge these Big 12 teams by their logos. They will prove you wrong. These are fighter programs. They showed it in conference realignment. They will fight to the bitter end, and they will assemble talent that you do not realize how good they can be. I'll admit, I underestimated some of these Big 12 teams, and then when you see them in person, you go, holy cow, the size of these teams compared to BYU, there is truly a gap. I underestimated that talent gap when BYU stepped in because I thought the BYU way can be good enough to still get 6 or 7 wins because BYU is just a tough out. They were not a tough out in some games, and I think that was what blew me away, and that some of the talent and the preparation, the coaching staffs in these Big 12s just far outclassed BYU, and I think that's a little bit discouraging. They made some progress at the end, Alex, against Oklahoma and Oklahoma State, but there's a long road to go for BYU because the glory of consistently being an 8 to 10 win team every year, I feel like that's out the door unless something drastically changes because this could be a program that's just a 5 to 6 win team on an annual basis, and it gets a little bit more challenging when you now know your rival is joining the league next year. The pressure's on. You got to step it up and change this thing in a hurry, and that's just the nature of college football these days.
All right, let's take another break here. I mean, this is reserved for our college or our Big 12 game of the week, and by far the Oklahoma State BYU game, the double overtime thriller, was the best game in the conference. It just ended obviously poorly for the BYU fans who don't get to go to a bowl game. I mean, it's weird.
Yeah,
I don't know. I mean, we're used to going mid-December somewhere, right? But in the end, they don't get that. But you know what they can do, Mitch? They can turn up the recruiting immediately, and that's what you hope they do. All right, we'll take a break. We'll come back. Our second hour, always featuring our power poll. Well, the power poll is basically going to look like the standings. I mean, we're set here. Let's get into it, and we'll talk about it next right here. It's First and 12, KSL News Radio, and the KSL Sports Zone. Stay with us.